I'm overlooking at the evergreen ash, tree number 22 off of South Drive in one of the little courts. And it's a significant tree. And if you look up at the upper canopy, there's considerable dieback on the right hand side, and there's a lot of foliage over on the left hand side. And we did not work on this tree last year. Somebody else has taken off this branch right here, and sadly they made a fairly bad chainsaw cut. It's a bad stub, but if you look closely you can see that they nicked into this big limb right here. I would get very upset if my guys had done that. So whoever's doing that, that needs to be corrected. It looks as if this tree has a trunk canker. There's some sort of a dieback going on here, and if you look all the way up through the tree, all the way, there's a drying out of that limb up here, there's a drying out of this limb up here. I'm afraid there's a problem going on, and we may need to consider removing this tree. Everywhere you look, there's a little bit of a drying out. Look at this lower area right in through here where the bark is drying out. There are a number of trunk canker diseases, but I have not seen a trunk canker disease that attacks this variety of ash. Fraxinus UDI has been pretty much a disease-tolerant tree, but we're starting to find more and more problems as time goes on. So from a wider perspective, you can see how green it is on the left, and this side over here is devoid of healthy foliage. Everything is dying back. So we may consider this for removal. This is at Southpark. I'm over kind of behind the pool over by 2513, and there are some dollar eucalyptus trees here. There's a grouping of 3 trees, and the large tree looks pretty good. We pruned it last year, and we made the recommendation last year to take off these 2 small trees on the left. And if you look up here, the foliage is really poorly, and there's a lot of dieback actually on both of them. And you got some competition here between the trees. Frankly, I think this would be a wise decision to get rid of these 2 small trees and allow the dominant tree to be just that, the dominant tree. So I'm going to make that recommendation, like 2513. One of the very expensive trees that we maintain, or the varieties, is the large evergreen ash. And while some of them need it, due to the high cost, unless they're really in bad shape, I think we're going to defer these trees, the majority of them, until next year, unless we see any real problems. This one behind the pool, it's got some dead wood up there, and some of it is actually the dead seed pod, so it looks worse than it actually is. But you know, I think you could let it go another year, in contrast to the one that's over on that side of the pool, the far side. That one looks pretty bad, so I'd recommend pruning that tree. And we've got the alders. It's an ongoing problem. Many of them are declining. This one over behind the pool is in pretty rough shape. It's got a lot of trunk decay, and if you look at the canopy, it's almost gone. It's not dead, but it's about 80% dead. And it's got so many dead limbs that if we pruned out the dead limbs, you wouldn't have a whole lot left. So here's one. Oh, look at that. Look at all the mushrooms at the base of the tree. These are not always evident all the way around. Yeah, those are armillaria mushrooms, the oak root fungus. And if you look at the base of this tree, they're growing right on the base. Yeah, I'm afraid this is a no-brainer. This tree has got to go. We've got root rot going on down here. You know, one of the difficulties in determining what needs to be done on any complex, and in this case your complex, is where do you spend the money? We realize that you only have so much in a budget, so we look at the trees, such as these liquid amber trees, and they're starting to get a little full, and they certainly would benefit from some pruning, but we have to ask ourselves, is it at a point where it is urgent, or are branches ready to break, or have they gotten so wide that they're causing a problem? And in this case, I'm going to say no. So I think that unless I find individual trees, most of the liquid ambers are in pretty good shape. Same goes for many of your there's a big ash tree, but many of the eucalyptus species in the complex. This ash has been cleared from the building. It's a little thick on the inside, but it's a big job, so we may defer that one as well. Now the tulip trees are a problem. They've been dripping from the tulip scale, and we've looked at the trees and they are totally infested with the scale. You can see the dripping caused by the scale. And there's a lot of dead branches in these trees. If we're going to prune them, it's best to do it while they're still in leaf. It's easy to tell what's thriving and what is declining. So if we wait till November, many of these trees have lost a lot of their leaves. I've always, been a little bit dubious about spending money on trees that are dying or declining. And many of your trees, like this one for example right here, it's got a lot of sucker growth along the trunks, but much of the limb structure, like up and through here, is dying back. And if you look way up the top, you can see that the tip dieback is throughout the tree. So it's doing everything it can to hang in there, but as a whole it's declining. So should we spend money pruning out the dead and try to preserve these trees, or you just kind of do a wait and see approach, and if they do die, then you put that money that you would have spent on pruning into removing some of them. Some of the Modesto ash trees are troublesome. They can be a real problem because they're such a widespread tree. This is one that we did last year, and it still looks pretty good. There's a little bit of interior sucker growth, but for the most part, I think we should leave this one alone for another year. We did a lot of the pear trees as well, and a few of them are very, very heavy, but we may be able to hold off on some of the pears. Here's a couple of trees that I've been saying get rid of them for years. You've got an Italian stone pine. It was probably somebody's Christmas tree. So like 2458. And this thing is going to erupt into an absolute monster. You can see that it's already all over the building. To prune it, to get it off the building, would leave it looking very silly. It's just getting a foothold on life, and in 10 years' time it's going to be a monster. And then you've also got this one mulberry tree. I think you've only got one or two mulberries in the whole complex. And this one has been falling over for many, many years. We've got to do weight reduction on it, keep it from, just gravity taking over and having it pull it out of the ground. But that might not be a bad idea to finally bite the bullet and get rid of this tree and realize that there's a nice grove of birch trees and copper beech behind. The crepe myrtles were a good decision. As you can see, this is a fairly old tree now, but it doesn't require much in terms of maintenance. Try to avoid harsh pruning of these trees. If the gardeners get in there and decide to trim them much as you see in parking lots, what it does is creates a higher maintenance tree. It'll create a tree that you have to prune every single year just to keep it in check. But if you leave it alone, it'll grow tall and thin in a V shape and be a very low maintenance tree. So in this case, with the exceptions of clearance and building intrusion or branches that are hanging in your face, they're very, very low maintenance trees. Now you've got a lot of stakes that are still remaining on many of your trees, these birch trees. In this case right here, you can see that the tree is holding up the stakes. The stakes serve no purpose. They're ugly. They should have been removed years ago. And all the way along the backside here is a row of redwood trees, and they're all staked. And once again, the trees are definitely much, much stronger than the stakes are. And if you're not careful, the stakes can actually, or the ties on the stakes can actually become embedded in the bark and cause damage. Now here's a situation right here where this stake is rubbing on the tree right here and causing damage to the tree, and very likely is being embedded up and through here. So time to lose many of your stakes. And now you have a number of eucalyptus trees on the property, and they, as a rule, are generally kind of high maintenance trees because if they break, they're very noticeable, and they usually have fairly big limbs. They're a brittle species of tree, and in this particular case, I do believe, you know, for instance, this limb over here this lower portion of the limb should come off. It's getting a little heavy, and some of the weight that's getting over the building needs to be brought back. Not critical, but it's one of these things that if you don't keep up on it, it gets out of hand really quickly. So many of the eucalyptus are going to need pruning. Now in the future, when you're making selections for trees, make sure that the trees that you plant have the right type of growth characteristic, so that if you plant a tree that is known to be an extreme tree, such as this Zelkova over here, that will become a very, very wide spreading tree, and two trees that are known to stay fairly small. What I project here is in 10 years' time, the canopy from this Zelkova is going to completely overshadow this nice crepe myrtle. And you can get away with the plum and the crepe myrtle this close together, but this planting here, that would have been better to have chosen a variety of tree that was consistent with the growth patterns of these slower growing trees. You know, it doesn't have to be another crepe myrtle, but there's lots and lots of choices. But bear in mind that some of these big wide spreading shade trees shade things you don't want them to shade. You've got a redwood tree that was put in back over here, and when somebody planted it years ago, they neglected to look up because the power lines are directly above it, and if you look at the tree, it's kind of hard to see with the sun back there, it gets topped off every single year by the power company. I was really happy to see that the redwoods that are planted across the way over there and all the way down, they did look up, and those don't seem to be a problem for future growth. But when you put in a redwood tree, or any kind of a tree, especially a fast-growing tree, it's going to get annihilated by the power company. Now here, once again, we're back to the tulips, and a lot of them have some pretty good-sized dead limbs in there. So if we were going to do the tulip trees, it would probably be best to do those sooner rather than waiting until November. So if we could get those knocked out while we could readily identify all the dead branches before it loses all of its leaves, it's much, much easier. So for this bid, I think we'll probably hold off on bidding on the tulips, and if you want to, you know, do like a average price per tree, or actually it might not be a bad idea just to hire us by the hour, 2 men with a bucket truck, and go around to do the best we can. So that's something to consider. And I know I've mentioned this before, but lawnmowers and trees, especially thin bark trees, where they get impacted by machinery, is on both sides of this tree, all the way around. That will significantly shorten the life of this tree. So the landscape company must be alerted to the fact that you're paying attention. This isn't fresh, it's been a few years, but you can see the impact from what happened. Wow, this tulip tree down here has just an incredibly sticky area around it. They did spray it just recently, so some of this is the water. They did the trunk spray on this with orthene. They're spraying for aphids, but the problem is the scale. The tree looks really good, but there's an incredible amount of scale up in this tree. There's a real good shot of the scale. You can see it on all these twigs down here. It's a really, really difficult problem to deal with. You know, every single one of these twigs down here is just totally infested with the scale. And I don't believe any external spraying is very effective. You know, I've actually had some pretty good luck spraying some younger trees with just high pressure water, and that seems to knock off a lot of the scale. You know, I'm always talking to the guys about how to make a proper cut, and this wound was made, 2 or 3 years ago, and for all intents and purposes I would have imagined that it was fairly correct. The species of tree is a Zelkova serrata, and I do notice that Zelkova trees, they don't seem to respond as well as a lot of other trees in their callus growth. I would have expected this to have developed callus up in this area and encapsulated this wound, but it's way down here. So I don't know. What do you think? Is that a good cut? Is that a bad cut? Obviously it didn't behave the way I had expected it to, so maybe the way trees respond is also species specific. I'm over at one of your monster trees. It's the big Fraxinus udii, the evergreen ash. It's number 675 right over on South Drive. And I would like to say that we don't need to do anything on this tree, but it has grown so fast and gotten so big, and so much of the weight is over the chimney and over the building, and a lot of it is sagging. This is also a variety of tree that you had a fairly large failure a couple years ago. One further down the road there lost a huge section of it, and if they get heavily laid with seeds, they can break. So I'm gonna have to put this one on the recommendation just because we have to play it safe. A few years ago I commented on the impact of using implants in the bark of trees to control certain insects. This is a hackberry, and they were getting hammered with the hackberry aphids. This year it doesn't seem to be too bad. I see a few. There's a few little white aphids up on those leaves there, so it's not devoid of it, but they're not too bad. But there was a problem, and it's been identified in the literature that hackberry trees do not respond well to implants, and there is the sign of more implants. These are the old ones. It's been done several times, and you can see it causes a trunk callousing, and in some cases that'll lead to decay. So it is it's in the literature. Do not put implants in hackberries. Now I've walked along and found yet another limb that was removed on a Zelkova, and the cut was maybe a little bit closer than the last one, and the callousing seems to be a little bit better. Boy, that's a tough call. It appears that it was either impacted or something, maybe squirrels chewed on that, and it's kind of cleaning up from the bottom there. That looks like an old flush cut that was cut too close, and it seems to be compartmentalizing the wound. I don't know what it's like underneath. The wood looks pretty decayed. I think I could run a screwdriver in there. Interesting. Now we got a couple of alders over in front of Fairview Lane, and while this tree has a lot of green foliage, it's pretty obvious that there is extensive decay in here, and this tree is not long for this life. The one adjacent to it is almost gone. There's very little life in it. So I know I'm repeating myself, but my recommendation is not to spend any money on the alder trees in terms of pruning, and just recognize that they all are on their way out. I'm over at 2468 Poet Lane, 2468 Poet, and back in the corner there's an Italian cypress that has actually been brought to your attention many times in the past, and it is, during the windy periods, it actually bangs on the rain gutter, and you can see the rain gutter is a little bit bent. It's got about an inch to go, so I don't really see any other options, but at some point in time you're going to have to get rid of this thing. And at 2474 you have a Magnolia solangiana. You don't have a whole lot of these in here. And this tree also is affected by a variety of scale. And if you look at the branches here, you can see all the scale on all of the branches. It's just everywhere. I've actually had pretty good luck washing these off with a high pressure washer. And if you hit the branches, you know, with a direct stream, you can actually knock off a lot of the scale. But this has the same exact sort of a stickiness to it that the tulip trees have. So maybe if you get somebody to target this with a hose, there's a hose right over there. Might be worth the effort. All right, let's try a little experiment here. Here is the branch that I'm going to hit with the hose. Let me hose it off really good and see how effective the hosing is. And kind of over between Lancaster and Hawkington, we got tree number 541, I believe. It's a large Modesto ash, and it has been attacked with anthracnose. It's a disease that causes all the leaves to fall off, and the upper canopy looks really bad. Down here you can see it's putting out some new growth, and over on this side, for some reason, this part of the tree was not attacked at all. This is a real anomaly. We don't see things like this too often, so I'm a little perplexed on this one, and my recommendation is going to be, let's do a wait and see. I can see a lot of the leaves show the symptoms of the anthracnose, and there's two big Modesto ash side by side, and they've both been hit. This one much more so than that one over there, but that tree has got a fairly sparse canopy on one side, so I'd say about 25% of that tree is attacked. But I see a lot of new leaves coming out, so I'm not quite sure what to say about this right now. Let's wait and see what happens in the spring.